It was the dry season of 2025, and the earth of Burkina Faso looked as if it had been carved and broken by centuries of sun. The ground split apart into jagged mosaics of dust, like old clay pots abandoned in the fire too long. The Sahel had grown used to this kind of silence, to cracked soil, to dry skies, to watching horizons not for signs of mercy, but for signs of more suffering. Planes overhead rarely carried blessings. They carried war, the hum of drones, the thunder of warcraft, and clouds, when they came at all, drifted without giving rain. But on this morning, something different happened. Eyes lifted to the heavens, and what they saw could only be called impossible. Military helicopters cut across the air, their rotors slicing through the dawn. Villagers braced themselves. Children grabbed their mothers' hands. Men clenched their fists. For decades, the sound of those machines meant danger, fear, occupation. And yet, when the bays opened, no weapons fell, no bombs, no bullets. Instead, a storm of golden seed cascaded from the sky. Maize, corn, not symbolic rations, not a handful of sacks for the cameras, but over 2,000 metric tons, raining across fields that had lain abandoned for years. It was not the United Nations. It was not a foreign NGO. It was not charity stamped with blue logos or foreign flags. It was an order from President Ibrahim Traoré himself, a man remembered for revolution, but rarely for reform. And yet here he was, giving an order that turned war machines into farming machines. In a single gesture, he had transformed symbols of terror into symbols of life. Across the countryside, the response bordered on the spiritual. Children ran barefoot through clouds of dust and kernels, laughing, holding baskets to catch the seeds. Elders wept openly, some kneeling, some lifting their hands to the sky. Entire villages fell silent, not out of disbelief, but out of reverence. For generations, food had arrived with someone else's flag. Survival came wrapped in dependency. But now, hope had fallen from the sky, and it was their own. And yet, for every miracle, there is resistance. As the seeds took root in the ground, doubts began to root elsewhere. In boardrooms, in foreign ministries, in the quiet corners of those who had profited from Africa's hunger. The Sahel wind carried not only the dust of hope, but the question, was this genius or was this folly dressed in poetry? Was Traoré a visionary, or was he playing his nation's last card in a gamble too bold to survive? This did not begin in a farm, or in an aid warehouse, or in the offices of development agencies. It began in a war room in the capital city of Ouagadougou. Traoré stood bareheaded before his generals and said words that sounded absurd. Fill the helicopters, not with weapons, not with soldiers. Fill them with corn. Within hours, fleets of aircraft were repurposed. No IMF paperwork, no donor conditions, no feasibility studies, just direct action. Soldiers became loaders. Mechanics handled sacks instead of shells. And the skies above Burkina Faso were transformed from harbingers of war into messengers of rebirth. When the first golden waves of kernels rained across the fields, the effect was immediate. Drums echoed in valleys. Songs were born on the spot. Villages declared the day sacred. Children painted helicopters in classrooms not as monsters, but as saviors. Farmers spoke of the sky as if it had become an altar. They called it the rain made of seeds. And weeks later, when the real rains came, the miracle doubled. From barren earth, green shoots broke through. From above, satellites showed emerald lines carved across the desert. But from the ground, it was not anomaly. It was resurrection. The Ministry of Agriculture released reports that startled even seasoned scientists. Germination rates were 40% higher than expected, even in areas long considered dead. Maize flourished. Villages once boiling thin millet gruel now roasted corn by the fire. Livestock fattened on stalks. Children ate until they were full. Clinics recorded declines in malnutrition, anemia, stunted growth. The change was measurable in bodies, in bellies, in spirits, and the people did not forget. But outside, the whispers grew. Brussels, Geneva, Washington. Reports dressed in technical language, certification, standards, parity, began circulating. Behind the jargon was fear. Fear that one of Africa's poorest nations had shown what no one wanted to admit. that dependency was not eternal, that Africa could feed itself, and worse, that it could feed others. European lobbies panicked. For years, they had flooded West Africa with subsidized exports. Now, if Burkina Faso exported grain, the balance would tilt. A leaked email from a European conglomerate said it plainly, "We cannot allow this to become a precedent." But Traore did not retreat. In Bobo Dioulasso, before a sea of supporters, he thundered, "They called it madness when we reclaimed our gold. They called it danger when we sowed our soil. And now they call it a threat because we feed our children without their permission." His words sparked applause at home and alarm abroad. Contracts followed. Saudi Arabia and the UAE signed long-term import deals. India and China expressed interest in maize, in ethanol, in processed flour. Suddenly, Burkina Faso's surplus was no longer surplus. It was commodity, leverage, currency. Critics sharpened their knives. Western analysts called it populism. NGOs warned of soil exhaustion, pests, monocultures. A British economist sneered, "A helicopter may scatter seed, but it cannot scatter stability." But in Burkina Faso, those words rang hollow. Farmers organized into cooperatives. Women led processing hubs, grinding maize into flour and pressing oil. Youth turned from migration dreams to agricultural entrepreneurship. Entire villages built wells, clinics, schools, with profits from corn. By 2028, government data told the story plainly. Over 70% of maize cooperatives were run by women. They were no longer waiting in line for aid. They were investors, leaders, policy shapers. Literacy among girls surged. Maternal mortality fell. Youth employment grew in processing, logistics, export. A generation once raised on the idea of escape was now building futures from their soil. The story reached beyond Burkina Faso. International media turned its lens on what had been considered invisible. Children roasting corn on sticks. Women pressing oil branded Sahel's sun. Youth managing cooperatives instead of boarding boats to Europe. A nation once framed as tragedy, now framed as defiance. But the backlash hardened. European trade commissions raised barriers, regulations, licensing, protocols, phytosanitary excuses. The reality was clear. When Europe sold to Africa, it was free trade. When Africa sold back, it was a threat. Traore responded not with surrender, but with redirection. Revenues funded irrigation, seed research, resilience centers. In Parliament, a young lawmaker declared, "We do not measure sovereignty in speeches. We measure it in harvests." His words echoed far beyond the chamber. Still, shadows loomed. Drought forecasts warned of harsher years. Pests threatened. Global pressure mounted. And yet the people clung to something no analyst could quantify. Ownership. Pride. A nation that had been invisible was now visible to itself. In villages, murals of helicopters rained across walls. On radio, songs of the seed rain played daily. Children wrote essays, not about escaping, but about returning to lead. Parents told them, "Study so you can serve this land." A psychological shift had taken root deeper than any maize root. Abroad in Washington and Brussels, policymakers struggled. Aid models, long unquestioned, cracked. Senators asked, what happens when the dependent no longer needs us? Farmers in America's Midwest listened to the story and felt a forgotten echo. Dignity through soil. Communities whispered, if helicopters can drop seeds instead of bombs, what's stopping us? By the end of the decade, Burkina Faso had done more than feed itself. It had written a new script for sovereignty. But the question lingers, as questions always do. Can it last? Can corn withstand climate? Can hope withstand pressure? Will the revolution endure, or will it be suffocated under weight of drought and geopolitics? The world is watching. Some pray it fails. Others pray it spreads. But inside Burkina Faso, beneath the Sahel sun, the truth feels undeniable. What began as 2,000 tons of maize falling from helicopters has become something no embargo, no regulation, no drought can erase. It has become memory, identity, a nation reborn not by permission, but by its own hand. And maybe, just maybe, it is the beginning of something far greater. A reminder that power does not always descend from palaces or boardrooms. Sometimes it falls from the sky, not as fire but as grain.